Hey guys, I'm Dorian and welcome to Massive In Depth number 14. Today we're going to be talking about Melbourne Bounce leads. This video accompanies the release of a preset pack from Sick Twisted Minds on, you guessed it, Melbourne Bounce leads. You can find the purchase and demo links in the description. So what is Melbourne Bounce? Well, I found this somewhat difficult to answer. The easy answer is to say it's a subgenre of electro house that utilizes Dutch house leads. But that's sort of a circular answer because Dutch house itself is sort of a subgenre of electro house. I even found it difficult to figure out who originated the style. Will Sparks is listed in several places as the creator, and he describes the genre as mixing classic bounce with new elements, including my voice, aka Dutch house. I couldn't fully figure out what classic bounce is, but I did find bouncy techno and bounce house, which, although older, were reminiscent of the style. The closest thing I could find to a predecessor for Melbourne Bounce was who I thought invented it to begin with, which was TJR. If you go to TJR's SoundCloud page and go back several years, you'll find bouncy songs that have the feel of today's Melbourne Bounce, and he was making stuff that was like Melbourne Bounce before Will Sparks. So I'm inclined to think that TJR is the real creator of Melbourne Bounce, but it seems that the genre sort of developed as a bouncing off of these two artists' styles, and then, it is what it is today because of everyone else as well. So let's talk about the sound design. While Melbourne Bounce relies heavily on the traditions of Dutch house, with ample use of sampled vocals and high-pitched saw waves with portamento and pitch bends, and Melbourne Bounce actually has had some innovations, or at least it's brought back other things from other genres of old. Most particularly in the use of highly distorted bandpass saws, which were not as prevalent in Dutch house. These highly resonant, highly distorted, interesting timbres are what we're going to focus on today. Though we'll employ a number of techniques to achieve a wide array of sounds, the focus will be on achieving the sounds that can be heard in the chart toppers of the genre. So particularly Will Sparks, TJR, De Oro, and the infamous Chainsmokers. I'm going to give you a few production tips as well to get you started in the genre, because once you have a couple of the initial tricks down, it's not incredibly difficult overall to make, though it is still very difficult to make a song that resonates with millions, as people like TJR and De Oro have done. Now let's start talking about the sound design. The stereotypical modern Melbourne Bounce lead is a bandpass saw run through clip distortion. I'm pretty confident most other artists listed above use Sylenth. I know for a fact De Oro uses Sylenth only, or at least that plus Ableton stock and outboard gear, and does not use Massive as far as anyone can publicly tell, and he seems to state pretty clearly what he's doing, so I'm going to trust it. So the easiest and fastest way to emulate De Oro is to grab Sylenth. And it's pretty much as simple as taking the init patch, turning it onto a saw wave, which it starts as, bringing it down kind of low, turning to bandpass. Don't even really worry about the initial settings, because the most important thing is to just turn on clip and clip. So yeah, pretty much you turn the filter on to bandpass, turn on clip, and then start messing around. I initially learned how to make Melbourne sounds in Sylenth, much for the reason I said before, because De Oro was doing it. Sylenth has a kind of particular sound, just like most synths do. It's not very drastically different. Like if I do the same thing in Massive, which I intend to do right now. Saw, max envelope, bandpass. Back to Sylenth. Massive. So you can see they sound different. Silent sounds a little bit warmer and fuller. With that said, Massive can be heard on a number of Melbourne Bounce tracks, and it has a much wider array of sound design options. So just because Dorian only uses Silent, don't think that you have to, or that it's the only thing to do. In fact, I'm pretty sure the Chainsmokers used Massive in Selfie because it sounds very much like Massive's own clipped bandpass saws, but with feedback and tons of reverb, like I'll dial in here. So you can hear the resemblance of their sound. I'm not 100% sure they use Massive, but it does kind of sound like Massive's feedback section and clipping with reverb. Let's just turn the reverb on. If you don't turn on tons of reverb, this will never sound right. I mean, Melbourne Bounce and Main Room are like, they completely rely on this stuff. I mean, TJR doesn't seem to use quite as much reverb as the other dudes, but Dorian just drowns everything in reverb, and it sounds awesome. He's very tasteful about it, but there's lots going on, plenty of thick reverb. So with that basic overview of the sound, let's start going into how to create it more in depth. So as I've stated, there are tons of sound design options for Melbourne Bounce leads in Massive. However, it can be difficult to achieve the final sound if you don't follow some guidelines. First of all, in most cases, the end goal is to get some sort of thick, resonant, distorted lead like we heard out of Silent and just and out of Massive, though it wasn't quite as thick as Silent's. In Silent, you only have so many options to do that, but in Massive, there's many ways to get like a kind of like thick, growly sound. A lot of the oscillators sound that way to begin with. You can use bin plus mode. You can use modulation. There's a lot of ways to get it. The important thing to mention is that the easiest and most effective way to get it is to bandpass a wave table that has interesting harmonics or harmonics that lead to that result, and then clip it. If you don't use the bandpass filter, basically I can't guarantee the end results. More or less, if you distort a bandpassed waveform and then do other stuff to it, you're more or less going to stay in the Melbourne Bounce lead area. You can get to it other ways, but this is the easiest way. So let's get there. Let's get to our starting point. So new sound, only have one oscillator on to start, move it to the saw all the way position, all the way to filter 1, band pass, center all your knobs, turn off your reverb. Put the clipping insert after filter 1 and crank everything up. And you can turn the cut off to try and get some kind of initial sound you like. So like I was saying, in Silent, you're pretty much done. You can add some envelopes or other modulation, but in Massive, we can do other things. First and foremost, in Massive, the most obvious thing to do is to switch the waveforms. Now, I started a list of waveforms that I thought sounded good, and I'm going to bring it up here really quick, but there were so many that I didn't think it was very valuable to put this up. So I'm going to show it and kind of give you a quick explanation of what's in this list, but then aside from that, experiment yourself. So take a quick look at this list. These were tested in the range of C1 to C2. But they, in most cases, it seemed like higher octaves also still sounded good. So read down. Now, this ended up being slightly over half the waveforms when in spectrum view, and nearing 100% of the waveforms when in bend mode. These are the positions in spectrum mode. When you were in bend mode, almost every waveform created sort of like a growly sound, and I'll show you some of these. In spectrum mode, you pretty much had to try different wavetable positions. Like a lot of these say position full left, position full right, and it didn't sound good anywhere else. And a number of these have lots of places, so they sounded good in lots of places. So over roughly about half the waveforms, if you try them in one of the either extreme spots on the wavetable position or somewhere in the middle, it should sound good. You have a 50% chance of that. So that's why I didn't really stress that too much, because there's lots of ways to get good ones. I'm gonna go through just a few of those, and then I'm gonna show you my favorite. So let's do math 1. See, full right, it's not bad, but it's just not very Melbourne-y. Not that that necessarily is either, but it's closer than this. I mean, this is more like electro or something harder. This could pass as Melbourne. Something else. Let's try groan 4, full right. Groan 4. So there you go. But it doesn't sound very far off from a saw. But my favorite was Wicked. If I can find it. Wicked. That's bronze. And I used it with bend minus. And I moved it up an octave. So from here, there's two simple extensions, either to layer the sound or to try and switch filters. Adding layers follows the same guidelines as above. I'm going to add a saw wave for illustrative purposes. If you want to change filters, you need to be careful. The results vary tremendously depending on the waveform, which I will show you. So I'm going to add the saw right here. I'm going to send it all the way to the top filter. All right, now I'm going to try switching out changing the filters with only Wicked on. All right, now I'm going to change it. So let's try comb. I'm going to switch to saw. Not nearly as cool. With both on, still not nearly as cool. All pass, turning saw on, not nearly as cool. Only saw. So I'm not going to go through many more for the purposes of time, but you can switch through these filters and they sound different depending on the wave you get and the distortion you have after it. But traditionally, either band pass or band reject is going to give you the best results, the easiest. And then it gives you room for experimentation. All right, so to finish off the basic sound, I'm going to add portamento. So let's make it mono. So you can hear the portamento. And I'm going to... Well, there's a vibrato macro already, but if there wasn't, I would set it like it was here. So macro 1 on depth and rate. And if you're going to be adding any more voices, make sure to set it to mono so that they all vibrato at the same rate. So from here begins sound customization, and you can go in any direction. You can start working with envelope modulation, filter cutoff, and pitch are the most common using envelopes. So changing the attack of the envelopes gives the very common whooping sound. Both positive and negative modulation are common, but the envelopes typically differ. So that was kind of a weirdly worded statement. So what am I saying? Start using envelopes on stuff, but it mostly only sounds good changing the pitch and the filters. So let's do that. And be careful how much you modulate a bandpass filter, because it's much more sensitive to sound changes than traditional filters based on the way they work, which I'm not going to go into much detail on. Whoops, there we go. I had the wrong envelope on the first oscillator, so it sounded weird. Okay, so whooping sound. Well, you set the envelope as follows. You put as many octaves as you want, but 1 is a good one to start with for the sound on each of your oscillators, and then a slight bit on the bandpass. And it kind of whoops it, like whoop, whoop, whoop. And it gets crazier the more attack you put on. And just changing the attack, you can hear like half the sounds in Moombahton and whatever else they call torque music now in the last couple of years. Like this is Diplo over and over again. Like with just changing this attack knob, you can probably make 50% of Diplo sounds, which is not a bad thing. I mean, more power to him. But it's just cool to realize. Level should probably be on full so that you get the correct pitch, so that when it reaches its max, it's in tune. Because if I go if I reduce the level, it changes the pitch, right? So this is basically giving us like an attack, a ramp on the beginning of our sound. So we go up a whole octave really quickly, and it goes whoop. You can go down to like -12 instead, but you need to change your envelopes. If you want to get the traditional sounds, like you can even hear this sound in some songs, but this one's more common. All right. Let's see. From here, we move into advanced territory because all that's really left are feedback and modulation for changing stuff. So let's start by using feedback. Open your routing window. If you're not familiar with this window, go check out Massive in Depth number 2, which goes over it, as well as the second oscillator section video for info on feedback. For the initiated, try each of your 4 feedback points while increasing the feedback knob, and see which one sounds the best. If things aren't a huge wreck, try and see if you can get more feedback out, but like don't increase it all the way, which it doesn't sound bad here, but in some instances it sounds horrible, just distorted mess. But don't turn up feedback all the way and then be like, why does this sound bad? And also don't not try different feedback points and say it sounds bad, because they matter. On some patches, like one feedback point just makes this huge bass like mess and not good. It's just all bass, unmixable crap. And you switch to a different feedback point and you get like clear high end. So this is important. In this case, it's not much of a difference. But then I'll probably assign a feedback knob. I mean, there's probably feedback knobs on like 50% of these patches because it's a super powerful tool. And when you've run out of things that are actually making any kind of interesting change, this is a good one, even if it's subtle. I mean, it's really good for when you're actually making or doing sound design, but even if you want to change the sound mid-track, like you're going into the second drop, you could like automate this to become more intense, or just switch it. even between sections, like your first 8 bars, it's normal, and then it goes hyphy. All right. So next, you can try the other insert effects. This is usually what I try last, so I'm not sure why I'm doing this now. But anyways, most of them aren't very good for these kinds of sounds. The tubes usually don't do much because it's already so clipped and distorted that it mostly just adds noise and reduces the clarity. So I don't really use... Actually, wait. I'm reading in the wrong section of my script, and that's maybe why reading is bad. I'm supposed to be talking about the rest of these. Okay. The other shapers sometimes sound good, but hard clipper is the best option overall for these kinds of sounds. I don't use high pass or low pass on these kinds of sounds. Simple delay, also not. Occasionally bit crushing or sample and hold will sound good, and sometimes frequency shifting, but you have to be pretty careful and subtle. My biggest piece of advice is to be really, really careful with this pitch knob and go really slow. Maybe hold shift, because you can get in between points that sound good where everything else sounds bad. I think some of the patches we go over will have at least one of the frequency shifter, sample and hold, or whatnot. But it's kind of advanced in the sense that it doesn't always create the most pleasing tone, and you might have to sample the results if you want it to be perfect. Okay, next is the modulation oscillator. This makes sense. I don't know. I need to be more careful when I'm reading my scripts. So these sound kind of good, but phase modulation followed by ring modulation are your most likely bets for this class of sound. The results of these can be pretty unpredictable. You literally never know when they're going to be useful. Sometimes they sound great, other times they sound horrible. Sometimes they only sound good in certain registers on your MIDI keyboard, so you have to play high for it to make the sound good, and the rest of the keyboard it sounds bad. So it's very much an experimentation game in all aspects, like which notes you're playing and everything else. After messing around with it for a while, you eventually get some intuition about maybe what's going to happen, or at least what your possibilities are going to be. If you want to learn these, I recommend going through these patches, like go through all 20 of them and mess around with the macros and see what happens. Maybe try and recreate them. That's the quickest way to learn how the sort of the advanced effects or parameters are going to affect your sound. Also, don't be afraid to change the mod OSC pitch slider to crazy settings. Like oftentimes it sounds good, like negative 36 or below. Very rarely do I have it up high. I mean, if you think about it, if you're already playing like a pretty high pitched sound, then if something is like 64 semitones above that, it's probably not even in the audible range. And if it is, it's just high-end junk that it can add noise or clarity that might be good, but for actually interesting timbres, it seems like lower values are better and higher values are better for noisy stuff, which has its place. So yeah, don't be afraid to change this like crazy. And going below the fundamental generally leads to less aggressive effects. So that's the simple way to put it. Sounds more interesting and less distorted. It's less aggressive. Finally comes the FX and EQ section, which I started introducing too early. Not many of the effects are useful or sound good. Once in a blue moon, the amps sound good, but after so much clipping, they don't usually do much. The dimension expander is good in very small amounts, but I recommend doing most of your ambiance and room reverb outside of the synth. The only effect I consistently like on Melbourne leads is the mono flanger, either in pause or neg mono mode, and with mild settings, like really low rates. These are non-traditional in terms of the genre, but sound good and kind of add this tense metallic sound to it, and can even clear up some of the distortion if other things are making it too distorted. So that basically does it for the sound design guideline portion, and should explain everything you need to know to make Melbourne Bounce synths in Massive. pretty much you start with a rich waveform, you bandpass it, and you distort it, and then you slowly add in other parameters like pitch modulation, feedback or the modulation OSC, and then the end effect with some messing around with portamento and vibrato, not much in the voicing tab unless you want to have multiple voices. And that pretty much does it. Most of it is in moving the cutoff filter and finding a really good point and distorting it properly and adding some +1, something that makes you different in the rest of the synth. So now I'm going to start going through some of the demos from the pack, and then I'm going to give you some production tips. Melbourne leads. Okay, so let's see, which ones are the demos? I have here, okay, 6, 7, 11, and 16. So 6. Okay, looking at this patch, you can see that we're doing the whoop thing because we have envelopes on the pitch, and it's controlled with this macro. We have clipping, of course, and some feedback, and we're using the modulation OSC, and we're using band reject filters instead of band pass. Okay, so let's check our waveforms first. We have rough math 1 in the first oscillator and 4-mint saw in the second. The first oscillator is down 2 octaves, and the second is our fundamental. Wavetable position is full right on the first, intensity full right on the first, and amp slightly less than full right. On 4-mint saw, full left on position, intensity full right, and amp full right, or just about full right. And both oscillators are going to the top filter only. All right, next is the filter section. We are in serial mode. We have band reject on both filters. Cutoff full left on the first. Bandwidth is slightly off of the full right. Resonance is twice that amount. Full volume. The second filter has the cutoff full left, bandwidth slight of center, and resonance is just above 3 o'clock. Full volume again. And the mix is all the way down. So the audio is running through the first filter into the second filter and out the second filter. Okay. Looking at the routing page, we have the clipping insert after the first filter and bit crushing after the second. The feedback is grabbing after the amp pan. And let's see, then I guess we have the modulation oscillator. We're set to 24 semitones above or 2 octaves. Only phase modulation is on, and it is set to the second oscillator. Portamento is in the center. There is no vibrato. We're in mono. There's 9 unison voices. Pitch cutoff is on, but it's not doing anything, so I'm going to turn that off. Same with pan position. And then we have always trigger. And then the EQ, we have, all right, just automation. Okay, so now let's go over all the envelopes and everything. Well, the volume envelope is fast attack and full sustain and a little bit of release. I'm pretty sure that's initialized patch release amount, so whoops. We have envelope 3 on the pitch of oscillator 1 and 2, and it goes up an octave, and the attack is at about 9 o'clock, and then, well, I'll go over the macros. Decay, not that it matters, full sustain, and a little bit of release, just like on envelope 4. Envelope 2 is about the same amount of attack as envelope 3, pretty quick. And then I think that might be standard decay and level, but if it's not, increase the decay to almost max. Yeah, that's definitely not it. Okay, increase decay to almost max and level just left of center, and release is in the middle or slightly left of middle. And you put this on the cutoff of the second filter, and put max depth. I think from there we only have the macros. Macro 1 goes to morph on format saw. Which is having a pretty subtle effect right now. Clip pretty much takes away most interesting things. Sounds either sound one of several ways with clipping on. Still not doing much. Oh well. Sometimes I fail. So clip obviously changes clip amount. Morph was on wavetable position of f-saw, but it's not doing much. Clip is on dry wet of clip. Bandwidth is on the bandwidth of the band reject. Just makes it go backwards just a slight amount, and it also increases the resonance about the same amount. 4 is the full cutoff amount on the band reject filter. 5 is the attack on the envelope, on the pitch envelope. 6 is phase modulation. Basically makes the sound gritty. And then the slight impact of feedback. All right, I think that does it for this patch. Unfortunately, this didn't have the most interesting macro system, but hopefully the next one will. So I think we're going to 7 next. Okay, we only have one oscillator. It's set to saw, 2 octaves above the fundamental. We're serial for no reason because we don't use a second filter. Band reject, cut off all the way to 0. Bandwidth at like 10:30, 11 o'clock. Resonance about 10. Mixes on 2, even though it could be on 1 and do nothing different because filter 2 is off. Our main envelope is pretty much the same as the last, except for there's a slight bit of attack. Clipping after, just before the amp, and then sample and hold after the first filter. Feedback on. Oh yes, you need to set the pitch of the sample and hold to almost max, but you need to tune this. You have to listen, play the note. Otherwise it sounds bad. Okay, phase modulation. 12 semitones above or 1 octave above, and yep. Slight bit of dimension expander, like almost off. EQ, slight bit of boost in all of these settings. Okay, I think it's macro time, or envelope time. Envelope 1 on the pitch of oscillator 1, going down an octave. Attack fast, decay is just left of, it's like at like 10 o'clock. No sustain, default release. And then this also is on the pitch of sample and hold, you can see here. Okay, first is vibrato. First macro is vibrato. You can see it on depth and rate. 2 is the cutoff on the band reject filter. It's full depth. 3 is the bandwidth on the band reject filter. It's like a quarter of a circle. 4 is sample and hold, full dry wet. 5 is rise. It's the it's the attack on the whooping envelope. 6 is the amount of clipping. P is the amount of phase modulation. And you can already hear there, it's creating a more interesting sound than the last patch. And then there's a very subtle, like, high-end boosting from the feedback. Yeah, and then the feedback is right there. I think that does everything. Nope, on clipping, there's also a change in the high shelf and the boost. Voicing, we have 8 voices. We're in polyphony, always trigger, vibrato. This needs to be mono, it's not set. Otherwise, it's going to be detuned. Unless maybe I did that on purpose. Maybe I did that on purpose. I'm going to leave it. Sometimes I use vibrato for detuning, but only a couple times. Okay, I think that does this patch. Next is 11. Okay, 2 oscillators, additive 4, and digicook 1. Wavetable position max, intensity max, band reject filters. They're both on, but God, man. Well, they're both on, but now the mix is set to the top, so it's only listening to this first one anyways. So, oh well. You can change it by moving this. But I'm going to describe the patch that's actually here. Okay, so band reject filter, cutoff set to like 10 o'clock, bandwidth in the middle, resonance left of center, like 10, 30, 11, mix at the top. Bronner tube in the center of dry wet and drive, slight bit of, or dimension expander all the way left on both size and dry wet. EQ set in the center except for frequency, which is slightly left of center. High shelf is left of center. This does nothing because if boost is in the center, it's not doing anything. Two kinds of distortion. Actually, no. What's going on here? Something weird's going on here. So, taking a moment of pause. So 5 must be doing something else also. Yep, it changes the bandwidth. Okay, cool. Sweet. That explains some stuff. This patch needs to be fixed. I'm going to have to update this patch. So, alright. So, now alright. Sine shaper. The clip isn't doing anything. Sine shaper, full left on the dry wet, drive full, feedback on at the in position after the amp and pan, amp all the way to the left on the feedback, modulation OSC, 2 octaves down, phase, ring modulation in the center on oscillator 2, phase all the way left on oscillator 1. And that does that. Now we have to do the envelopes. So envelope 1 does something somewhere. I think. Nope, that was just some kind of glitch from the last patch. Alright, so the only envelope is this one, and it just has a little bit of attack. Full sustain. Loud. Default release. Macro 1 goes to vibrato. Glide goes to number 2. Or sorry, number 2 goes to portamento, or the glide time, and goes about halfway on the depth. Dimension expander increases dimension or dry wet in size just a tiny bit. 4 increases the high shelf about a quarter of a circle or slightly more. 5 is the amount of sign shaping. 6 is the amount of feedback. It's about a fifth of a circle. 7 is thickness, and that's a bad explanation of bend minus on the digicook oscillator. And then number 8 is the phase modulation on oscillator 1. And that's changing the PM, the phase modulation. All right, one last patch, number 16. Okay, silver. Wavetable position is, I don't know. I think this is actually 10 o'clock. Everything else I've been saying was 10 o'clock was actually like 11. This is 10 o'clock. I'm terrible at clocks. Terrible. I don't really know how to describe these macro positions otherwise, because unfortunately, Massive thinks it's special and that you shouldn't get position readouts because they want you to feel like you're using an analog synth. And they actually say this in the manual. They don't give value feedback so that it's more of the experience of using a traditional synthesizer where you don't have that. And that's just like has to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I hope Native Instruments maybe hears this and recognizes that they're assholes for even considering that you should have any impact on how I use this thing. If I want to put precise numbers in, I should be able to. It's probably one of the biggest drawbacks on this synth. So to any developer that does give you those, thank you very much for living in the 21st century. So with that said, wavetable position as it is at this spot that I can't really give a very accurate description of. And then we have a saw for the second. Intensity is set at full on spectrum for both, and the second oscillator is 1 octave down. The third oscillator is on, but the amp is all the way down. It does nothing. The center top oscillator has its filter set in the center, but I don't think it's doing anything because it's only set to mix 1. Yeah, so this might as well be there. Okay, top filter, band pass, cutoff left of center, bandwidth to the right, resonance slightly to the right, filter volume max, slider mix to the top, pan centered, volume slightly down. It's the first time I've talked about volume, but it should be slightly down in this patch. Otherwise it's loud. Flanger on, dry wet set to the minimum, rate set to minimum, feedback at, I guess this is once again 10 o'clock, depth 10 o'clock. Nothing on the second insert. EQ boosts right of center. I guess that's 2 o'clock or something. 2 o'clock, 1:30. Clipping on, max, dry wet, max drive. It's after filter 1, no insert 2. Feedback point is after filter 2, but filter 2 is not getting any audio. No wonder some of these things don't do anything. I guess I'm not as awesome as I thought. Oh well. Yeah, some of the macros, they might be misset like that, but for the most part, I think the issue happens in that I'm like designing a sound and you're doing everything, and then you change something, and you don't realize that that change impacts somewhere one of your macros or something else. So because I start with a bass sound, obviously there's no macros or anything, and then I try a first effect, like I don't feedback, and I'm like, oh, that sounds cool, so I put a macro on it, and then later I'll change something else. Maybe I'll switch the filter routing or something, and that feedback was set on for the second filter, and then I changed where the filter routing was, and I didn't go back. I probably should have gone back and checked, but that's kind of like the design workflow. It's like, well, you're going in a straight line trying to design this thing, and sometimes you have to go back and make changes, and You probably need to double check that all your macros still work. One thing I didn't mention was that there's a performance on the wavetable position of the first oscillator. It kind of just adds like this grit. Okay, so like I was saying, clipping after the first filter, feedback all the way left, now that it does something, and the depth up to the center. Ring modulation on the second oscillator with the modulation OSC pitch at 0. Phase all the way to the left on oscillator 1. Envelope 1 is on both of these, and it only works if 5 is increased. It basically increases the level of this envelope and increases the amount of ring modulation and phase modulation. I think I already said this, but 7's on feedback. Voicing 4 is on pan position. 3 is on detune. We have 3 unison voices. Our detune max is 0.5 or half a semitone. Mono always trigger. I don't think I mentioned the LFO settings, so it's this kind of performer, and then the rate is set in milliseconds at this position. And then we have flanging, and I think this is, yeah, okay, so then it just moves the depth up to about half. Oh, well, I did the wrong last preset, so I guess I'll just do one more. I was supposed to do 16. So I'm actually not going to talk this through because I'm getting tired of talking. So look at the oscillators. Add oct, these settings. Format square, these settings. This OS3 is off. Filter 1, band reject, these settings. Serial, second oscillator, band reject, this setting. Bandwidth, resonance settings, mix setting, tube, doing nothing. EQ, OSC, restart via gates on. These voicing settings, routing, global for no reason, envelope 1, envelope 2, envelope 3, envelope 4. Okay, so bit crushing, I'm going to just leave it here. Okay, so bit crushing set to this setting, clipping set to this setting, and they're after filter. Insert 1's after filter 1, insert 2's after filter 2, feedback's after the amp pan, feedback all the way left, phase 22 octaves above. It's on the second oscillator, phase set all the way left. Macro 1 is on the wavetable position of the first oscillator, macro 2 is on clipping, macro 3 is on bandwidth of the first filter, macro 4 is on the cutoff of the first filter. Sorry, macro 3 is also on the resonance. Macro 5 is on the attack of envelope 3, which controls the pitch or whoop. Deep controls the amount of phase modulation, and number 7 feedback, and 8 brightness is the amount of high shelf. Okay, so this pretty much completes the sound design portion and should explain more than enough for you to check out the demo patches and work through them. If I didn't do a perfect job explaining through the patches, you can download all of these except for the last one that I explained and shouldn't have necessarily. Also, we have a full run through of this pack on the Sick Twisted Minds YouTube where you can hear what every one of these patches sounds like as I move the macro knobs. So if you want to hear more of what these sound like before you get them, or just to see what you can do with Massive, or to watch and to get the settings of the patches, because I pretty much did what I did here. I went through all a number of this. I basically just showed the front screen with the macros, but you can get a lot of the sound out of that. So there's like 20 patches there that you can recreate. And then, yeah, download the demo or buy the pack from sicktwistedminds.com. Last thing, I'm going to try and go over some production tips. I got to go open up the demo. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is sampling. As I played this MIDI clip right here, now you can hear some notes sound good and other notes sound like just too distorted and weird. And the most important thing to notice is that the notes aren't consistent. Even if they all sounded good, they're not the same sound. And this is where sampling comes in. If you're using crazy settings on massive, like feedback and whatever, to get a certain tone, but the sound doesn't sound the same on all of your MIDI notes, then you're gonna need a sample. This is the result of that. You can hear this is me sampling that sound. At 2 different octaves, and this is the original. So you can hear that each one of the samples sort of brings a different character from the original sound, but this, I think, the second one is the one we're going for the most. The only thing to note is that you do lose some of the character because Massive is kind of dynamically reacting to stuff. Like the filter is maybe saturating too much, and the clipper is making that sound, and then there's feedback and blah blah blah, and every note ends up sounding a little different. Whereas if you sample, every note sounds the same unless you do like round robin sampling or something. I'm not exactly sure what the big artists are doing, but I suspect they're doing quite a bit of sampling. It would make sense based on some of the difficulties that go on in the synth, but I think that there are problems either way. So I'm going to use this sampled sound right here and just briefly describe how to make Melbourne Bounce, I guess. So that's the bass. This is the kick. So the kick and the bass are in F. I've seen them in G, but it seems like F is one of the more popular ones for whatever reason. The kick and the bass need to play together. So the kick lasts about 2 eighth notes, or no, 2 16th notes or an eighth note, but it cuts off slightly before with some release. And then the bass starts pretty much slightly before or slightly after the offbeat. So pretty much your kick is in this position right here, and then your bass is in this position. And you need to change their lengths and their decays on the envelopes to get them to groove together. Now, I'm not claiming that this is like the best or end-all to end-all Melbourne Bounce setup right here, but I think it's good enough for a lot of people who are lost in the genre to work. And you can hear as you change the kick MIDI note what happens. I gotta change to just this one MIDI note. It totally changes the groove. Same way as you change the envelope. Now, I can't change the groove of the bass because I just sampled it from one of my tracks. I made 3 Melbourne Bounce tracks before deciding it wasn't really for me. And this was the result. Or not this was the result, but this sample came from it. This is basically... I'm sure there's more than one way to do it. I think I did it using... You can do it with one synth patch. It's kind of like a plucky saw bass. So pretty much, I think like one oscillator saw, maybe with unison, definitely all with voice retriggering, and then the filter all the way down, and you use the filter cutoff, the filter envelope, like the attack and the decay, the attack and decay, and you use those when you're making the kick and bass. So you like draw on your MIDI note for the kick, you draw on your MIDI note for the bass, you change the lengths of the MIDI note for the kick, you change the lengths of the MIDI note for the bass, you change the envelope for the volume and the cutoff on the preset, and also on the kick. So you're basically just changing the envelopes and the MIDI notes on your kick and bass until they sound like they're moving together. To get the high-end bite on the bass, I did it 2 different ways. One way that seemed to work is using an audio effects rack in Ableton, and you basically just frequency split. Well, not really, because you make 2 chains. You have one pass through clean, and then you high pass the other one so that you just have the high end, and try bit crushing. And I think this is how this one was made. Try that. This isn't really a tutorial on the bass, but I wanted to go over that pretty quickly. And after that, you just need your Melbourne Bounce sound, which we have right here, and you can get from the demo. And you need your Melbourne Bounce MIDI pattern, which this may or may not be a good one, but that's for you to decide as an artist. So make whatever you think is a good MIDI pattern from Melbourne Bounce and combine them. Now, that doesn't sound very correct, and the reason that it isn't is because you need a lot of reverb. I was going to say a bad word, but I'm trying to not say extremely bad words on this channel. Now, obviously that doesn't sound like a pro track, and of course it doesn't, because I just made it full dry wet. They do tasteful things. They combine reverbs. First of all, I know for sure that Dorian is occasionally using this reverb, if not all the time, because it sounds like it. But I'm pretty sure the Chainsmokers were using room reverb. And you need to add some like pre-delay to the reverb so that it has this like bouncing back sound. So early pre-delay. Maybe not ambience, more like yeah, like live room, where it's not, the tail isn't so big. Early delay. Okay, and then add the other reverb in. And then you do other stuff. You EQ, but don't EQ too drastically. Like in Main Room and Melbourne Bounce, you need some of the lows from the EQ to fill out the track. If you cut them too much, the track sounds weak. So I would say probably the most impressive thing to me about Main Room and Melbourne Bounce production is how well they EQ the reverb and produce it to pretty much always be sitting there drowning out the track, but not drown out the track at the same time. And then, you know, side chaining the EQ can help to give it groove. We should also side chain the bass, because I haven't done that yet. Wait, no, I mean the lead. You don't really have to sidechain the bass too much in Melbourne Bounce because the kick and bass play off each other, but it certainly helps a little bit depending. You want to sidechain the lead like a lot and very quickly. That's how it gets that kind of like sucking, bouncing sound. So like between the kick and the bass, sort of like bouncing back and forth, and the sidechaining on the lead, it's sort of this wave of moving you back and forth. And then you have to fill out all the other parts of the track, mix it well, and, you know, master. For better or worse, mastering is actually part of the production process for making club music. Like, it just does not sound as powerful and appropriate without it. Like, I was shocked to just see the power of multi-band compression, and not just in making things loud, but also in adding a character to the sound, for better or worse. It's kind of hard to describe. I don't really have the sophistication to do it, but that's the last step in achieving the sound. It's doing all of these things well. Layering, you can layer the lead like with the same lead or a different lead, like an octave lower and EQ to fill out more of the track, making an interesting melody, adding like whoops and off beat things, vocal samples, and yada yada yada, and that's kind of where you go from here. All right, I think that finishes up Massive in Depth number 14. Thanks.